Welcome to another deep dive today, and we're going to be looking at a part of the Bible that I think a lot of people are curious about, Leviticus 18.
Yeah.
This chapter really dives into the topic of prohibited sexual relationships.
Right. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about Leviticus is that amidst all these laws and rituals, you get this really fascinating window into the social and moral fabric of ancient Israel. It's not just a list of don'ts.
Yeah.
It's really a reflection of how they understood their relationship with God and the kind of society they were trying to build.
So it's not just about personal morality here, but something that really shaped their whole community.
Absolutely. And the text repeatedly emphasizes this need to distinguish themselves from the practices of the Egyptians and the Canaanites. It's almost like a declaration of their unique identity.
Right.
A way of saying we're not doing things the way everyone else does them.
That idea of setting boundaries really jumps out at me. It's like they were creating a blueprint for a society that reflected their covenant with God.
That's a great way to put it. And that covenant wasn't just some kind of spiritual agreement.
Right.
It had very practical implications for how they lived their lives, how they structured their families, and even how they understood their place in the world.
So let's dive into the specifics of those boundaries. What kind of relationships were explicitly forbidden in Leviticus 18?
Well, the chapter starts with, I guess what you say, the most fundamental relationships, those within the immediate family.
Okay.
Parents, siblings, grandchildren, all of those are off limits.
Yeah.
And it's not just about blood relations. It extends to certain in-law relationships as well.
Okay.
So man's father's wife, his daughter-in-law, his brother's wife.
I'm struck by how those specific in-law relationships, seem connected to inheritance laws and the preservation of family lines. It's almost like they were trying to prevent any confusion or conflict over property or lineage.
That's a very astute observation. I mean, these prohibitions weren't just about individual morality. They were about maintaining social order and stability within the community.
And this idea of order extends even further, right?
Yeah.
The text also forbids relationships between a woman and her daughter or granddaughter.
Right.
And it explicitly prohibits a man from marrying two sisters.
Precisely. And those prohibitions are particularly interesting when we consider the practices of surrounding cultures. Polygamy, for example, was common in many ancient societies.
Right.
But it was strictly forbidden for the Israelites.
So it's not just about avoiding incestuous relationships. It's about establishing a very specific set of norms that define what a proper family structure looked like.
Exactly. And that's where this concept of nakedness comes in.
Okay.
It's not just about physical exposure.
Right.
It's a metaphor for the violation of a relationship that's considered sacred.
You mentioned earlier that the term cut off is used to describe the consequence for violating these prohibitions.
Right.
What exactly did that entail?
Yeah. So this is where things get really interesting. Being cut off from the people wasn't just some kind of legal punishment.
Yeah.
It had profound social and spiritual implications as well.
Right.
So imagine being exiled from your family, your community, even your relationship with God.
Wow.
It was a complete separation. A severing of all ties.
That's a heavy consequence.
Yeah.
It really highlights how seriously they took these laws and how deeply they were intertwined with their religious beliefs.
Absolutely. And it also raises all these questions about how these laws were enforced.
Right.
And how individuals actually experienced this punishment,
Yeah.
Was it always a literal exile? Were there rituals associated with being cut off?
Right.
These are questions that, historians and theologians continue to debate.
With such severe consequences, it makes you wonder if there were any exceptions to these rules, or if there's any evidence that some Israelites still engaged in these forbidden practices despite the prohibitions.
That's a fascinating question, and it gets to the heart of how we understand this relationship between law and human behavior.
Yeah.
Even with strict prohibitions in place, there's always the question of how those laws were interpreted, applied, and sometimes even challenged in real life.
It's like we're peering behind the curtain of these ancient laws and catching a glimpse of the complexities and contradictions of human experience.
Exactly. And that's what makes studying these texts so captivating. It's not just about understanding the past,
Right.
It's about grappling with these enduring questions about morality, social order, the human condition.
This is already so much to unpack, but I feel like we're just scratching the surface.
Yeah, it really is. And as we dig a little deeper into Leviticus 18, we find some more pretty intriguing details that I think help to shed light on the values and the beliefs of ancient Israel.
I'm particularly interested in the inclusion of prohibitions against sexual relations during a woman's menstruation and relations with animals. These seem to kind of go beyond the realm of kinship and family structure.
You're right. Those prohibitions point to a broader concern with ritual purity and holiness.
Okay.
Menstruation in many ancient cultures was seen as a time of ritual impurity, and there were very specific rituals and practices surrounding it.
So these prohibitions weren't just about, like, personal hygiene or morality.
Right.
They were tied to a deeper understanding of the sacred and the profane.
Exactly. And it's fascinating to consider, how those ancient beliefs about purity and impurity might have shaped their worldview.
Yeah.
And even influenced their social interactions.
It makes me think about how even today, certain bodily functions or states of being are still surrounded by taboo or stigma.
Right.
Even if we don't necessarily connect them to religious beliefs anymore.
That's a great point. It shows how these ancient ideas, even if they're not explicitly acknowledged, can still have a really subtle influence on our perceptions and behaviors.
There's another detail that really caught my eye. In Leviticus 18.17, relationships with a woman and her close female relatives are described as lewdness. That word choice just seems to carry a stronger weight than simply saying something is forbidden.
Absolutely. The term lewdness implies this heightened sense of moral transgression.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about breaking a rule.
Right.
It's about violating a fundamental societal and religious norm.
Mm.
It really suggests this deep sense of revulsion and disgust associated with these acts.
It's almost like they were trying to emphasize the severity of these transgressions and how they could potentially disrupt that social and spiritual order.
Precisely. And that brings us back to this idea of Leviticus 18 as a blueprint for creating a society that reflects God's will.
Right.
These prohibitions weren't just about individual choices. They were about establishing this collective sense of right and wrong, this shared moral compass that guided the community as a whole.
But even with that shared moral compass, I can't help but wonder how effectively these laws actually shaped behavior.
Yeah.
Were they universally followed? Or was there a gap between the ideal and the reality of how people live their lives?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's one that, historians and archaeologists continue to grapple with.
Right.
We have these texts that lay out the laws and the ideals.
Yeah.
But reconstructing the lived experiences of people in ancient Israel is a complex and nuanced undertaking.
So we might never have a definitive answer to that question.
That's right. But the very act of asking these questions and wrestling with these ancient texts, I think, can be incredibly enriching.
Mm.
It allows us to step outside of our own cultural assumptions.
Right.
And consider how different societies have grappled with these really fundamental questions about morality, sexuality, and the meaning of life.
It's a reminder that the conversation about what's right and wrong, what's acceptable and unacceptable,
right,
is an ongoing one that has spanned centuries and continues to evolve even today.
Exactly. And Leviticus 18, for all its ancient and seemingly distant prohibitions, offers this fascinating lens through which to examine that ongoing conversation.
It really feels like we've uncovered a lot about ancient Israel just by exploring this one chapter. Mm-hmm. What would you say is the biggest takeaway for you from Leviticus 18?
Well, for me, the biggest thing that jumps out is this realization that these prohibitions weren't just, like random rules. Right. They were really embedded in this worldview that saw sexuality as like intricately connected to holiness, to purity, and the very fabric of their community. Mm. And it's a good reminder for us, I think, that ideas about what's considered, moral or natural are often really shaped by this much larger cultural and religious context.
Yeah, so even though these specific laws might seem very far removed from our lives today, the underlying principles and the way they reflect a society's values still resonate.
Absolutely, and it challenges us, I think, to really think critically about our own assumptions and biases.
Right.
What we might perceive as purely personal choices or individual freedoms today were in ancient Israel very deeply intertwined with their understanding of their covenant with God and their collective identity.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how much of our own understanding of morality and relationships is still influenced by these ancient ideas, even if we're not consciously aware of it.
That's a really thought-provoking question, and it's one that I think Leviticus 18 really invites us to explore further.
Yeah.
It encourages us to look beyond just the surface level of these prohibitions and really engage in a deeper conversation about, this complex interplay between culture, religion, and morality.
So what would you say to our listeners who are thinking, okay, this is all very fascinating,
Right.
but what does it have to do with me? What's the key takeaway from our deep dive today?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that Leviticus 18 really gives us this valuable lens through which to examine our own assumptions about sexuality, relationships, and really the nature of right and wrong. It reminds us that these conversations are never simple, and that what's considered acceptable or unacceptable behavior is often shaped by forces that go way beyond individual choice.
It's like a call to engage in thoughtful reflection and respectful dialogue, recognizing that there are diverse perspectives and interpretations on these issues, just as there were in ancient Israel.
Exactly. And perhaps most importantly, it encourages us to approach these discussions with a sense of humility.
Right.
Acknowledging the complexities and nuances that have challenged societies for centuries.
Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive into Leviticus 18. Thank you so much for walking us through all this.
It's been my pleasure. It's always rewarding to kind of dig into these ancient texts and discover the questions they pose about the human experience.
And for our listeners, we'll leave you with this final thought. While the specific prohibitions of Leviticus 18 might seem like relics of a distant past, the broader themes of, holiness, purity, and social order still continue to shape our world in subtle and often unexpected ways. So as you go about your day, think about how these themes are playing out in your own life and in the world around you. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.